Okay. My name is Brooke Ambrosius, and I am presenting about Guatemala's civil war and how the U.S. impacted it and practically began it. So yeah, bananas and blood, U.S. interference sparked Guatemala's 36-year civil war. So starting with some historical context, um, Guatemala as a whole, why it was intriguing for the United States. Latin America as a whole was intriguing to the United States because of its location and its vulnerability, in quotes, to communism, according to the U.S. Um, During this era of the Cold War, there was a big fight between democracy and communism worldwide, and that caused a lot of proxy wars. And so, regarding Guatemala, it was an ideal climate and geography for agriculture conditions, which meant that it was good for exportation and economic growth. Um, yeah, bananas and coffee were, you know, grown there, and they were huge, the main exports to North America. It was the waste of the Americas, meaning that it had access to both the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, which meant that it was good for trade and travel. Um, it was vulnerable, meaning it was a good target for the US to intervene in because it was vulnerable, because the government was not necessarily stable. It was looking for foreign investments, which meant looking for foreign influence. Um, it wasn't looking for foreign influence, but that comes with foreign investments to improve their infrastructure. They needed modernization within their economy and within their infrastructure. They had cheap labor, as in the indigenous population. They could, external influences could use the cheap labor because it was you know, easily acquired, I guess. The government did not protect indigenous rights at this time or the time after it, as we will see later on in this presentation. And the Banana Republic had control over almost the entire nation and its politics, meaning the um that one industry controlled its not only its economy but also its politics. Okay, can I get rid of this? Okay, local politics. Just kind of going through what led up to the Civil War. Manuel Estrada Cabrera um, was the first president within the nation to establish the United Fruit Company within the region. The United Fruit Company was a Boston company, so it was a United States company, and um, Cabrera asked them to come in to help build up the infrastructure and build up the ability for them to produce agriculture. He disregarded indigenous rights from the beginning. We're kind of starting at a point where I'm starting timeline wise where the United Fruit Company came into Guatemala because that's what kind of sparked the Civil War and the lack of human rights. Um, yeah, there was no respect for the Constitution, and he was overthrown in an armed revolt from 1920. So even before the Civil War started, there was a unstable government. There was a lack of respect for the presidents, even though obviously he wasn't a good guy, but there was just overthrow, revolt, coup after the other after the other. Jorge Ubico was president from 1931 to 1944. He also favored foreign companies and landowners. He replaced native slavery with vagrancy laws, which instead of being slaves, they were just forced to work specific hours for specific landowners, which I believe is the definition of, slavery or slavery, like to a point. And yeah, he protested labor unions, students and teachers protested him, which eventually caused him to resign. Um, there was a huge divide in classes within Guatemala. throughout this entire period between the high elite and the low poor students, teachers, middle class, and indigenous. So that's kind of where this like back and forth went between the um, like between presidents. So although one would be overthrown, the elite would have the power to put a new one in place for their own good. Either way, Juan Jose Arevalo was president from 1945 to 1951. He created labor laws, better education, and increased political participation. So he basically started improving the infrastructure. Um, During this, he appointed Jacobo Arbenz, I think, as his Minister of Defense. This Jacobo Arbenz was the president that eventually got um, overthrown during the CIA military coup. So Juan Jose Arevalo was important because he basically he was the what's the word? Like he was the president before the communist president. Um, he began land reform, but he didn't succeed at it. He started bringing up the idea that land was for the people, was for the indigenous population, and that external influences like the United States and the United Fruit Company should not be in charge of all of Guatemala. So he basically set up Jacobo Arbenz to create reforms, to begin these reforms. So what is the United Fruit Company? It was a Boston company from the United States. It started in 1920 within Guatemala, but it was also in like Costa Rica, I believe, and other countries in that region. But we're going to focus on Guatemala. In 1920, it gained land concessions, tax exemptions, and infrastructure control under Manuel Estrada Cabrera presidency. So this basically began their ability to control politics within the region because they had access to as much land as they wanted for cheap, and they were even given like the ability to control Guatemala's like postal service and railroads. So they had power. They had power from the beginning. Um, from 1920 to 1940, that connection grew really deep. They had those control over the infrastructures, and so they began gaining political control and economic control of the nation, even though it was an international company. It was not a Guatemalan company. Um, that basically meant that instead of growing solely for the infrastructure, it was also um, like the infrastructure of the state, the country. It began only mostly only aiding the United States economy. So from 1940 to 1950, the state began to develop and gain power to oppose foreign influence, rising demand for agrarian reform. That was during Jacobo. What is his name? Arevalo. No, Arbenz. So then it's right there. So 1951 to 1954, he became president. He pushed for land reforms and removed the United Fruit Company UFC from political interference. So he set an offer for, hey, we're going to give you can't have control over our land anymore. This is our land. This is our country. But we'll give you $1.6 million to, um, you know, eh, just to make peace. Like, here, take our money. We get our land back. And the US said, no, we want $16 million. And he declined. So, which makes sense because the country did not have the means to pay $16 million. And also, it was their land. So, morally, he did not feel, like that was right. So, the United States, within this, how it kind of set up the Civil War, the National Security Doctrine, the Truman Doctrine of 1947 began with Eastern Europe, I believe, like the idea of Eastern Europe and its vulnerability to communism, but it moved to Latin America and Asia. So with that, all leftist movements were treated as possible communist threats. Um, Anything that seemed like it could have been like far from right leaning was seen as a possible communist, you know, threat. So that's why they justified intervening. Um, it established concern within Latin America and it justified intervention. I already said that. Business interests. It was a huge export of produce and it was cheap. It was cheap to produce. It was good to produce because of the land. It was, it's in the mountains. It's fertile. It's the perfect place to grow agriculture. Um, because of that, because Guatemala needed an international influence to help start their own economy, their agriculture economy, um, it allowed the United States to dominate infrastructure networks, meaning they had control over railroads, transportation, postal services, and governmental tasks. Because, and over time, that became bad because then they still had control. Um, it was like a domino effect. It started because they needed it, and then it just got worse, and they got more power, and more power, and more power, and then basically they were controlling the entire nation. And they were doing it. They were controlling it with any means possible, any means necessary to stop communism. I hope that's not in the screen recording. The CIA in Operation PB Success. So, Jacobo Arbenz was seen by the U.S. as working as an ally to communists, and he claimed that he damaged U.S. business interests in Guatemala, meaning he wanted to take back land and give it to Guatemalans. But that was seen as communism. So as a result, they did PB Success, which was they began with isolation techniques. They weakened the support for the leftist government by growing um, by creating like this idea of communism and how bad communism was towards the higher class, towards the military. So they also made the government look weak by using economic sanctions. So like because the leftist government was in power, they were like, okay, we're no longer going to trade with you. We're going to do these sanctions and we're going to make you look bad so that these elites were like, oh, maybe like this isn't going to work. Like we need to go back to having this right leaning military forward government. Um so that's how it started. Then the big day, the big thing. Um excuse me. They the CIA funded and convinced Castillo Armas to begin a movement, like a forced movement, to get Jacobo Arbenz out of power. So the U.S. bombed the government and military buildings to scare the population and show vulnerability, which is literally terrorism. They performed an act of terrorism in order to scare the public um, away from this leftist movement. Castillo Armas attacked from the Honduras border, so he's kind of like he had a very small army, but it was more of a mental thing. So all of this it began as mental. Like they played with the idea that the leftist movement was bad by, those isolation techniques. And then they said, okay, we're going to scare the people by bombing these big civilian areas, killing civilians, killing government workers to scare them into, aligning with the U.S. interests. And then they used the military general Castillo Armas to like begin war from the Honduras border, even though under like there was I think they had 480 men, so like there was no way that they could have actually taken control of everything within Guatemala, but it was to scare them. It was to get them to work, to get them to follow. So eventually, Arbenz resigned because he did not want any more civilians to die. Um, and because he lost military loyalty, which is huge in these Latin American countries at the time, because the military was the main infrastructure of what they had, right? Like throughout, I mean, thinking about Chile, like it was the same thing. The military gained power and then the government lost power. But the reason why the military was able to gain power is because it was already so strong and it was already so powerful. Okay, local government interference by embassy. Um, the embassy worked closely with the CIA to undermine the government, and create a divide between political power and military power. Um, so they once again, broke that bond between the military and the government. Um, it spread propaganda. It said, hey, like the left party is doing bad, like it's all these bad things. It's not going to help your country. You're going to fall to communism. This is going to be what your life looks like. Like, look at this. Don't you want to be like America? And then it coordinated military training and organization. So moving on to that, the CIA, oh my gosh, the CIA recruited exiles for a proxy rebel force. This is the force that moved from the Honduras border up into Guatemala. So it funded this movement, and it provided weapons, and it taught logistics on how, like, okay, this is what you're going to do and this is how it's going to work. There was not enough to defeat it. I already went over this. It was a psychological attack, and it scared those within the military to follow um, in the footsteps of their, see, a captain, like the general. Okay, impact on the people. Um, Colonel Carlos Castillo Armas. This is the man who was convinced to lead the attack from Honduras into Guatemala. Hold on. Wealth divide caused military to favor the right wing. So there was this huge gap, like I said, between the middle class and the high class, but almost everyone in the military was in the high class because it was one of the only infrastructures that was actually working at the time, which meant money. So because of this, they favored the right wing because the right wing allowed them to be in the high class. It allowed them to, not fall into that middle and low class. And they didn't want to. They were looking at themselves and they were self preserving. Um, oops, there's a typo. US infiltrated military and taught anti communist ideology, creating a massive fear of communism. I already talked about that. They basically convinced the entire military, starting with Colonel Carlos Castillo Armas, that communism will kill you and communism is the worst thing in the world and you will die. And then the US also assured Castillo Armas that he will, get power if he follows through. Like, hey, we will make this happen. All we need is your influence, and we will give you power of Guatemala. So he was like, okay, sure. Public's reaction. Initial supporters of the coup. So the coup, came into Guatemala, bombed the government and military buildings, boom, pushed Jacobo Arbenz out, and then that was the coup. That was a military coup. Initial supporters thought that it would rebalance the government and maintain economic interests, because they were like, this communist is giving away the land, like we're going to lose all this money from the United Fruit Company, when in reality the money from the United Fruit Company was only helping like that small percentage at the top, and that's why the Civil War began. But over time, fear and disorder spread throughout as a reaction to oppression, because this became a dictatorship. It became a, like, complete control. There were genocides, there were everything. So people became scared. Castillo Armas was assassinated in 1957. This is where the Civil War begins, in 1960, because so Jacobo Arbenz was democratically elected. I forgot to mention that. He was democratically elected within the nation of Guatemala, but the United States didn't like that. It was the same idea as Chile. I keep referring back to Chile because I feel the most comfortable talking about that right now, just because I learned about it so much while being here. But these presidents were being elected. They were being democratically elected and not controlled, but like, it was for the people by the people. But the United States said no, even though the United States protects democracy and liberty, but not when it comes to communism. So, um, let's see. How do I make sure that I'm recording? Oh, it is recording. Okay. Oh no. I'm sorry if this is all over the place. Okay, 1960, failed military coup. This is where everything kind of goes to, like, out of the window, like crazy everything. I mean, it was already kind of crazy, but this is where, like, it was like president after president after president. 1960, failed military coup. 1963, overthrow of Enrique Perilada Azuria. 1966, civilian elected president Julio Cesar Mendez Montenegro was elected, but coerced by military pressure throughout the term. So my point with this point is that there was president after president. None of them worked. None of them stayed. And all of them were oppressing anyone that was not in the military, meaning, but the United States continued to fund this. By 1970, state terror increased and indigenous groups began organizing against the repression. Okay, this is what I mean by violation, like the people were not being treated right. So there were violated democratic processes. The initial one, he was elected, Jacobo Arbenz was elected democratically. The United States funded a coup. That was a violation of the democratic process. And then like all of this, the military coups, any coup is a violation of democratic process if the democratic process was valid. So there was continued violation of democratic process. The initial terrorism within civilian areas, the U.S. funded this terrorist act. Like they gave the ability and the planes to bomb these buildings to scare the people, which is crazy. They politically oppress people. So these right wing. I mean, I know I said that there was like three, 1960, 1963, 1966, 1957, or 54. Yeah, 54. Like these are all different presidents, but all of these presidents are doing the same thing. They're all politically oppressing. They're throughout this, unions were disbanded by the government. The labor movement ended. There was unlawful persecution. Death squads began against the leftist movement, like without trial, without anything. Um, the indigenous population was massacred. Over 200,000 were killed throughout the Civil War, and 83% of that number was indigenous people. It was an authoritarian government, which means it repressed speech, had targeted assassinations, and there was no due process. There was no legality in any of the movements. It was totally under military control. And in the 1980s, let's ignore that part at the bottom for a second. But these are all human rights violations. These are all examples of how these governments did not protect the people. But with that being said, the United States funded all of this. I'll get there in 1 second. With this, the silent Holocaust was between 1978 and 1983. In 1978, so we're just kind of going through time here. This was like that was throughout the whole thing. This was until 78. Another president was elected, General Fernando Romeo Lucas Garcia, and this grew conflicts nationwide because he was so far right. He increased the amount of killings and like oppression and death squads to a crazy amount. There was like 100 extrajudicial killings in 1978, and in 1981, this is all during his term. 1981, 10,000 killings recorded. This is just recorded. In 1980, he began Operation Sophia. It intended to end oppositional guerrilla warfare by destroying their bases. So during this period, there was an organization of the indigenous population. They were fed up, they were tired, they were being killed, they were being assassinated, none of their rights were being protected. So they started organizing and carrying out these guerrilla warfare techniques in in their homes, which is like these rural areas, where they would like attack the military because I feel like I don't need to explain how guerrilla warfare works, but because of this, because they were organized in these small villages, it's known as the Silent Holocaust, Operation Sophia. This general organized the destruction of 622 villages, or 626 villages throughout Guatemala. There were 200,000 plus disappeared at this time and 1.5 million displaced. as in like their homes gone. They have nowhere to go. A lot of them went to Mexico or up north to seek refugee to seek a refugee camp. And they even enforced a scorched earth policy, which meant that they burned all like anything that they could, the villages, the homes, the the farms. So they couldn't eat. If they survived, they couldn't eat. If they survived, they couldn't sleep. They had to run. They had to leave. They were scared. They were, it was like this is crazy. This is terrifying. And when I learned about this, I was like, why don't I know this? Because this is so scary. And all of this was funded by the United States. Well, not this wasn't directly funded by the United States government, but it it was because the United States began the Civil War, even though it was a democratic election. Do I have another one after this? No, this is it. It was a democratic election. It ended contact with the Guatemalan government in 1977 because it was going too far. It was, violating human rights, even though it was doing that well before 1977. But then again, the Reagan administration in 1983 began communications again with Guatemala and provided resources to destroy the Mayan population. So the Reagan administration allowed this. This was considered the darkest chapter within the Civil War. I couldn't go into depth about the entire Civil War because I wanted to focus on human rights since this is a human rights course, and I also wanted to focus on the United States' role in it. Um, but I think the biggest takeaways were the fact that the United States once again violated a democratic election and that they continued to knowingly fund these human rights violations. With these staggering numbers, like 200,000 disappeared, gone, killed, probably more. Um, and 1.5 million displaced, without homes. And then they go as far as to burn everything that these people own. Um, all of this was for the United Fruit Company, for these business endeavors, for these economic gains, and for the fight against communism, um, which in the case of Guatemala, the fight against communism was, I guess, a fight against land reforms, giving it back to the indigenous population, and the people of Guatemala as a whole. Um, so yeah, that is my presentation. How do I stop this? Uh, okay, thank you. Bye. Oh no, like this.